Thank you all for joining us here today. We really appreciate you spending a portion of your day to talk to us about this very important issue, which is really to debunk some myths and to talk about some of the terms that are really putting innovators and inventors in a bad light, and really that, the terms that fit on bumper stickers and are easy to repeat, but don't really have a lot of meaning or often are really misleading. This is a term that or a topic rather that I've written about quite a lot, and one that is very, very important to me. So I'm glad to be here to talk about this with everyone here today. So look forward to having a wonderful conversation with you all today. We have not very many slides. We do have a one-page PDF that I'll make available to you as we get going here. But what I would like to do before we jump into the conversation proper is I would like to introduce our panel here today to get us going. So let me just look at my controls here, and we will introduce the panel. And starting from the top left is Chris Israel, and Chris is a partner at ACG, and he is also has the distinction of being the first IP czar, that is the intellectual property enforcement coordinator. He is also the executive director of the Alliance for U.S. Startups and Innovators for Jobs. And in the top right corner, we have Andrew Spiegel, and he is an attorney, and he is also the executive director for the Global Colon Cancer Association, and he is going to be talking to us an awful lot about the research and development that goes into bringing life-saving treatments to the marketplace. And then in the bottom left, we have Professor Adam Mossoff, who is a professor of law at the Antonin Scalia School of Law at George Mason University, and he's also a senior fellow and chair of the Forum for IP at the Hudson Institute. And he's written on patent thickets in particular, but many topics, and has testified in front of Congress many times. And then last but certainly not least is Timothy Lee, who is the senior vice president of legal affairs for the Center for Individual Freedom. And the Center for Individual Freedom is the sponsor for this event, and they have as their mission really to protect and defend the individual freedoms for individual guaranteed by the Constitution. So we're happy to have them here as a sponsor and working with us to put on this event here today and to talk about this very important issue. So what I would really like to do is, before we move forward with the presentation that Tim has to kind of wet our whistle to talk about this, is to go around the horn, gentlemen, and get your preliminary thoughts on this topic. And I'll go in the order in which I introduced you. So Chris, we'll start with you. When we're talking about the myths of patents and the myths of antitrusts and these terms that roll off the tongue so easy and fit on bumper stickers, but really don't necessarily have a particular meaning or definition, where do you want people to focus their attention as we start?
Yeah, no, it's tough, Gene, and thanks for inviting me to participate today with this great panel. And I think, the world that we tend to occupy most frequently is trying to have this conversation with policymakers and staff. And, we've got a new administration now, so you've got a whole new set of leaders and potential leaders on this issue, and trying to kind of work your way past some of these decade or so old myths is tough. How do you kind of get past this idea of bad patents and trolls and go to a place where we'd like the conversation to be, and the points we try to make, at least from the perspective of trying to frame this conversation, on behalf of startups and inventors and some of the investors that are behind that. We hope to talk about things like competition with China, and those who are interested and concerned about that issue, and everyone is, the importance of IP in protecting our great innovative capacity against the Chinese. There was a Senate Intelligence Committee hearing just this week, and the former director of the National Counterintelligence and Security Center, noted research that they've done that said in 2020 alone, between $300 and $600 billion worth of U.S. IP and trade secrets were stolen by the Chinese Communist Party. So, I'll tell you who doesn't think we have bad patents in the United States. It's the Chinese. They, in fact, think we have very good patents and trade secrets and intellectual property, and they're in a 24/7 effort to take that from us. So I think, when we get into conversations about supporting investments in the U.S., we're going to spend, potentially 100 to 110 billion in this new package that the Senate passed, this U.S. Innovation and Competitiveness Act, going to semiconductors, artificial intelligence, robotics, cybersecurity. If we're putting those types of resources behind these critical and strategic industries, it's our view we better be backing that up with a strong patent system. And finally, you mentioned the idea of competition and antitrust, and we think it's critical for those policymakers who are concerned about the size and abusive tactics and power of particularly some of these big technology companies to realize probably one of the best tools you could give to competitors, particularly smaller ones, to compete in the marketplace with the companies that have established that type of size and abusive position is to allow them to have strong and robust patent protection and intellectual property protection. And instead, we're talking about undermining it and taking it away from them. So, those are some of the elements of the conversation that we want to move to. And it's tough, as you said, Gene, to get past these, myths that, we're kind of in this constant battle to debunk and refute. And so glad to have the chance to do that today.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Chris. I appreciate you being here. Andrew, let's move over to you and get your thoughts on this topic as well. I know in our pre-call, I was really interested to hear a lot of what you had to say. And I know you come to us from the Colon Cancer Association, and that's also very near and dear to my heart because that's a disease that has affected my family in a very big way as well. So thank you for being here.
And thank you for having me. Colon cancer has affected my family as well, which is why I got involved with this disease more than 2 decades ago. And I think that the stories that I could tell today to the audience really reflect those 2 decades in the patient world. First in the United States for half of my career, and now in the last more than a decade, I've been on the global space in the patient advocacy arena, running the Global Colon Cancer Association. And so I personally saw back in the late 90s when my mom was diagnosed with colorectal cancer, the lack of innovation. What was world like then? There was one drug approved for colorectal cancer that had been around for more than 30 years and was highly ineffective. That was it. There was one treatment choice. And as a result, when you had metastatic colorectal cancer in the 90s, you had a 95% death rate within the first couple of years. And the average life expectancy was about 7 or 8 months, about the same time my mom lived. And so fast forward now, 20 years later, there's more than 16 approved drugs in the United States for colon cancer. And what have we seen? You could talk about these bumper stickers, but when you actually talk about data, we've seen a drop of the death rate of more than 50%. 50%. Breast cancer can't say that. There's almost no other major cancer that you can say the death rate has dropped over 50% for the metastatic patient over the last 20 years. And that's solely because of innovation. And that's the space that I'm living in colon cancer. But I could go on and on all day with examples, but a couple of other ones that people should be thinking about when thinking about this issue is, well, what does this have to do with what we're talking about? Colon cancer and innovation and IP, how do they all come together? Well, the way they come together is that without innovation, we don't get to these treatments. Look at the hepatitis C space. When my goduncle got hepatitis C, it was just in the beginning of when these treatments were coming out, these new treatments for hep C. And we know that the old treatments were very ineffective. They were very harsh on the patient. They didn't cure it, and they were extremely expensive. Now you look at the treatments for hep C, it's cured. They literally cure this disease with a few weeks of treatment. And what has IP done for that? Well, it encouraged the development of that drug, and it encouraged the development of competitors so that the prices come way down for this hep C cure. And I really wish that my uncle could have gotten access to that cure because he would still be alive today. He was a perfectly healthy guy, except that he got Hep C in the Army. So you look at that, we're now talking about cures to previous death sentence diseases. We're seeing in the cancer world life extensions that are beyond our imagination just 10 years ago. And all of that is happening because of the investment that was done a decade and a half ago in innovative medicines. But the point that ties it all in is that these investments don't happen without IP. Without IP, investors don't invest, right? We know that because they're investing a lot of money to get a drug to market. We know that the success rate in getting a drug to market is extremely low, maybe 3 to 5% of initial drugs that start out actually make it to market. So you're talking about a cost of billions of dollars to get a drug to market. And with all that risk, there better be assurances on the other end that if you do get a good drug that's helping people, that you're going to be able to recoup your investment. And that all relates to IP. And I'll finish with what I talked about in the prep call, which is there's no better example than right now with COVID-19. And I happen to have had two pieces that ran in the last week on this exact issue. One ran in Penn Live, and then just today in Delaware Today, very targeted placement. I have an op-ed running on exactly how IP and the challenges to IP can affect cancer patients. And the bottom line is that we're less than 2 years into the first exposure to this virus. And because of IP, we had incredible investment into this vaccine. The vaccine got developed. The vaccine was more than 95% effective. And we just heard from Moderna today that 6 months later, it's still 95%, 94% effective in preventing this virus. So, incredible that this was developed. And not only developed, this vaccine has now been administered in more than 4 billion arms around the world. And there's current challenges to this system that's working. And there's no question this system's working. Less than 2 years out, more than 4 billion people have been injected with an extremely effective vaccine. And there are challenges to that right now, right here in the United States. And our current administration is actually supportive of breaking the patents on these very effective vaccines for certain places. And that really is a short-sighted viewpoint in my point of view. And that's what my op-eds talk about, because if you take away the incentive from industry to develop and distribute a massive vaccination program like this, who knows what this virus could have done if we didn't develop these vaccines? Who knows how many, could it be billions of people would have died from this disease? We don't know. Thank goodness we won't know because of innovation and because of IP. So I could go on, but I'll stop there. And hopefully I tied that together for the folks listening.
Yeah, no, and we'll come back to an awful lot of that here in a little bit. So we'll put a pin in that. But amen to everything that you just said. So thank you very much. I appreciate you being here. So next up, what we want to do is pivot to talk about some of the law. And Adam, you've been at the forefront of writing about this issue and these issues in particular for innovators, but taking a critical look at the history of the law, probably more so than anybody that I'm familiar with. So not to pigeonhole your initial comments, but in any particular way. But glad to have you here, number one. And the floor is yours for the moment. What are your initial thoughts here?
Thank you, Gene, and to Tim for sponsoring this great panel, and I'm really honored to be speaking here with Chris and Andrew and Tim and you. Just it's awesome, and everything what Chris and Andrew have said is exactly right. That there's really it's really important to get past the rhetoric. This is the patent policy debates for 10 or 15 years now have really been dominated by more rhetoric that have brought a lot more heat than any light. And the light, of course, being really data, evidence, and facts about the nature of our patents as a driver of innovation and as the platform for our innovation economy. It's why, as Chris mentioned, China has been interested and has had a policy for 20 years now in stealing our IP. It's because it's been successfully produced here, and it's been shown again and again and again. And I really want to hit on this point, as you mentioned, I do a lot of work on the law and the history. You hear a lot of times that patents are monopolies and patents stifle innovation and patents restrain knowledge transfer, and the exact opposite is the case. In fact, the evidence on this is overwhelming. Historical, economic, and other evidence that patents are not monopolies. They don't restrain anything. In fact, they are property rights, and they function in the exact same way that property rights function in every other area of our economy, whether you're talking about a farmer or a factory owner or a small business owner. They are platforms for economic activity and innovation and economic growth and jobs. And everywhere where you see patenting activity, you see all of those phenomena happening. And this has been a key fact of the U.S. patent system that we historically, secured effective and reliable property rights. We were the very first country to do this. You take patents out of this framing of monopoly interests that they originally were defined as in England and other countries. We said in this country, no, we're going to protect them as property rights. And this is what made people like Samuel Morse and Charles Goodyear and Thomas Edison and Alexander Graham Bell and Nikola Tesla and so on and so on, all the way up to today's biotech innovators. And in fact, as Jonathan Barnett puts it, which ties into Chris's comments earlier, that patents in fact are one of the greatest anti-monopoly devices that have ever been invented. Because it's a property right that gives one individual the ability to negotiate as a peer with a massive corporation. And they can take down that entire corporation, which patent owners have done repeatedly through the cycle of innovation in this country's history. And unfortunately, there's been policy debates through this entire time as well. It's as old as this country, as old as patents. They've been attacked and they've been accused of all sorts of nefarious things. And this happened today. People say, oh, there's patent thickets, where there's too many patents and people can't compete with the patent owners, or that's how that term is used in the biopharma space, or there's so-called evergreening of continuation of patent terms and things of the sort. These are largely rhetorical terms that make for great bumper stickers and make for convincing potentially policymakers to make unfortunately ill-informed decisions at times. But if they actually focus on the data and they care about data-driven policy making and evidence-based policy making, they would actually realize that no, in fact, these patents are actually functioning perfectly well. As Andrew mentioned, we have a thriving industry. We've been able to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic in an unprecedented way. The biotech industry was made possible in this country because we were the very first country that said biotech innovations will be protected by our patents. This is the U.S. Supreme Court decision in 1980, and this has been universally recognized as the birth of the biotech industry, and it's why almost 2/3 of all biotech innovations occur in this country, in the United States, because of that foundation, that legal foundation of reliable and effective property rights, which made possible not just investments, because patents don't just incentivize invention, but as Andrew explained, and as I think Chris was touching on as well, they are the bridge from the act of invention to the marketplace. They function as property rights. They make possible contracts and commercial dealings. They make possible the creation of the value chain, the distribution mechanisms in the marketplace that convert an invention in the marketplace into usable actual innovation that benefits consumers' lives and benefits people in society. And this is done again and again and again, as Andrew explained with the data on cancer cure rates now, but we now have cures for hepatitis or treatments for hepatitis, diabetes. My daughter has a seizure disorder, and there's incredible treatments for that now that didn't exist even 10 or 15 years ago, let alone 30 years ago. And this has all been made possible and facilitated by our patent system.
Yeah. And before I turn to Tim here, I just want to make one observation, because this is a topic that I've written on quite a bit over the years myself, and I've lectured on this. Patents are not monopolies, and it doesn't matter how many times people say it, doesn't matter who says it, and it doesn't matter why they say it. They're wrong every time that they say it, and for a very simple reason. A monopoly presupposes that there's a marketplace for what it is that you're trying to sell. And for the overwhelming majority of patents, 99% of patents, there's never going to be a market other than for information. The patent owner is enticed to provide the information for the public benefit. That's all that they're doing. They're putting the information out there. And there's never going to be a marketplace for the product or service that is tied to that that information. But the public benefits nevertheless. In those rare instances where there is a market for the product or service, then the patent owner gets the benefit. That's the quid pro quo. That's the exchange. But to say patents are monopolies just totally misunderstands the market, it misunderstands the economics, and it misunderstands the incentive on a very fundamental level. So it's frustrating when you hear all these economic writers over the years say, oh, yes, a patent is a monopoly, and it clearly is a monopoly, and the Supreme Court, who is supposed to know a thing or two about antitrust law, say patents are monopolies, when so clearly the economic evidence is against that argument. It's like fingers on a chalkboard. So, it doesn't matter who says something that's wrong. I think we're at the point where we need to just say, look, that's wrong. It doesn't make a lick of sense, and that's what this webinar is about, is to try and shed some light. I think sunlight really is the best disinfectant, and unfortunately, for whatever reason, on the pro-patent, pro-innovation side, too many people, I think, have not been willing to engage in that conversation. That's another conversation for another day, so we don't need to go there right now. But Tim, I want to turn to you to first get your preliminary thoughts, and then we can pivot to the couple slides that you did have prepared for us today. So, Tim, what do you want folks to focus on as we move forward here today?
Well, I suppose compared to the other speakers today, what I would focus on is the 30,000-foot level view. The causal relationship between strong patent rights and innovation, because the United States stands unparalleled in terms of innovation, and you've got to ask yourself, is that coincidence? Why are we so far and above other nations, not only today, but throughout our decades and centuries in terms of invention and innovation? And you look at our strong patent right tradition that others have spoken about here, and you see that that's a causal factor, not just a coincidental one. And so I'll focus on that. Another thing I want to do is CFIF just ran a public opinion survey in conjunction with a very well established group, Public Opinion Strategies, and it comes up with some very, very encouraging points in terms of public acceptance of intellectual property and patents that I think will surprise a lot of people. So what that helps do is point out that we're not just winning on the merits of these arguments and on the substance, but in terms of public opinion as well. So elected leaders need to keep these things in mind because the public agrees with them. And so to the extent they try to contravene these, and they try to contravene some of the points that I and the others today will be making, they're running against public opinion. And so they've got to be aware of that as well.
Yeah, no doubt. And it is good to see public opinion changing here. And maybe it is changing because people understand that it was the innovators who brought these vaccines to bear in such record time. Hopefully that's the message that people are getting. I mean, I see the messages that are out there, and I scratch my head, and I think I'm living in this alternative reality. This is great news. 70% of Americans are vaccinated, at least one shot. Over 50% 2 shots. There's going to be 12+ billion shots by the end of the year. We had vaccine in a matter of months because that's when the trial started. I mean, these are all great stories. Now, I understand a lot of people unfortunately lost their lives, and there's no way to sugarcoat that. That sucks. That's terrible. But the good news is innovation is working to provide the answers that we all hoped it would. I wish that message would get out as loud as some of the other messages, but we'll talk about that too. So Tim, let's get out there the couple of slides you have. I'm going to push it so everybody can see the myth versus facts on product hopping and patent thickets. So they're seeing that now.
Great. And there are a couple more down below it. I believe Adam or one of the others referred to evergreening, and there's also pay for delay settlements. These are pejorative terms that opponents of strong patent rights sort of create to create in people's minds these negative impressions and terrible connotations. But as the others will get into, they're inaccurate terms in and of themselves, but allowing them to sort of seep into our thinking and undermine strong patent rights will have very, very negative effects. So I won't steal others' thunder, and I'll speak very briefly. But I do want to make a couple of important points. You said a moment ago that we witnessed this firsthand over the last year and a half, where government allowed private pharmaceutical innovators to accelerate vaccine production and creation. And so I think that explains a lot of our positive poll results. People saw this firsthand. Government got out of the way, said, you guys do it. And the American pharmaceutical sector led the way in that regard. So that's proof that I think everybody out there listening can recognize right offhand. So I do want to thank everybody who's joined this call in this webinar. This is literally a life or death debate. And so these things are important. And here's one way of illustrating it helpfully, and it ties back to what we said earlier about America's tradition of strong patent rights and other intellectual property rights. Frankly, the United States, year after year, accounts for roughly 2/3 of all new drugs introduced to the world. 2/3. To put that in perspective, the United States accounts for about 5% of the world's population. And while the United States has the world's largest economy, even it's about 24% of the world's economy, roughly speaking, but 2/3 of all new pharmaceutical innovations come from America. Now, you've got to ask yourself, how can that possibly be coincidence? What explains that? Well, one of the best ways to explain it is to point out, as others have already, the United States leads the world in terms of intellectual property protections. It's in our Constitution before the Bill of Rights were ratified. It protects those inventions and creates that property right. And this goes even further to common law and to philosophers in England, John Locke, et cetera. But to point this out, let's go to Abraham Lincoln, who was himself a patent attorney at one point. He had a great quote, and he said, the patent system in America added the fuel of interest to the fire of genius. It creates that expectation of a property right, which incentivizes creation. Nobody has protected intellectual property and patents like the United States has through the decades and centuries. And nobody, whether today or throughout human history, comes close to America in terms of innovation and inventiveness, scientific, artistic, but in this specific case, in terms of pharmaceuticals. That is a causal relationship, and we need to respect that. And when I say this is a life or death situation and life or death debate, some people nevertheless want to undermine strong patent rights, and that will cost lives. So people need to be very, very careful about this. Really quickly, before I move into the 4 terms, and I'll let others get into them in detail because they can do it extremely well using analogies that I think everybody watching or listening will find very helpful. I do want to talk about this public opinion survey that CFIF did with public opinion strategies. I think Bill McInturff rings a bell to a lot of people out there. He's often on the news, and the Wall Street Journal cites him a whole lot. So this isn't a fly-by-night survey. This is a very reliable mainstream survey service that produced this. Really quickly, the first thing I'll say is by a 3-to-1 margin, which is an amazing margin given the partisan divides in the country right now, a 3-to-1 margin, people prefer that government play the role of oversight and creating incentives for invention, not dictating outcomes and not using a heavy hand to regulate the issues we're discussing today. How does that play in with this? Well, we're talking about government trying to step in and undermine strong patent rights, getting more involved. The public doesn't want that by a 3-to-1 margin. So that was extremely encouraging. Really quickly, I'm just going to talk about a couple of things, and I'll let the others start to speak. In terms of intellectual property specifically within this poll, and I'm going to read this very carefully, 83% of Americans favor strong intellectual property protections that encourage innovation rather than undermining strong intellectual property rights. Strong majority, 66%, believe that instead of waiving intellectual property rights, as we saw the Biden administration propose with COVID vaccines, that it's better to keep strong intellectual property rights and create licensing and allow licensing of things that have been patented rather than just abrogating those patent rights and giving them away to the rest of the world. And so by a 63% margin, people worry that undermining intellectual property rights will create safety concerns, cheap knockoffs that don't do the job out there. And so these are all very, very encouraging things, because I think even those of us on the panel who work on these things on a day-to-day basis sort of come away with this impression that the public just wants free stuff. They don't care how they get it. They want to undermine patent rights because it'll get things into their hands more quickly. That's just not the case. By overwhelming majorities, when we're talking about 80%, 75%, that crosses party lines. So this isn't a right-left divide. It isn't a Republican-Democrat divide. These are overwhelming majorities that disagree with things like the Biden administration waiving patent rights for our pharmaceutical innovators on the COVID vaccines. They disagree with that. And so really quickly, and you can see from the slide, and I'll let others speak more specifically about these because they've written about it extensively, but there's product hopping, patent thickets. The slide you'll see there describes what they are and why these are false and pejorative terms, evergreening, and then pay for delay settlements. So I'll leave it at that, and I'll let others speak more specifically in terms of that. But the news is very, very encouraging in terms of public opinion. It's also very, very encouraging if you just take a 30,000-foot level look at American history, how far we outpace not only competitors today across the world, but throughout human history. And that's the result of strong intellectual property rights. And it's a life and death matter that we not weaken those intellectual property rights by starting to toss around terms like anti-competitive and antitrust. It's just going to cost lives, and it's going to make those innovations less likely in the future. So thank you very much.
Sure. Thanks, Tim. Chris, let me turn to you here for a second, because one of the things that is always interesting to me is, particularly when we're talking about these terms in general, because they fit on a bumper sticker and because members of Congress and their staffs have so much that they're focused on, and patents and innovation, as much as we in this industry would like that to be the most important issue for them, it's not. I mean, when COVID happens, maybe innovation, at least in the biopharma area, becomes, incredibly important. And at moments in time, it's incredibly important. But overall, I mean, they're looking at the economy and jobs and in China and national security and the Middle East. And, how do you break through these bumper sticker slogans to get your message across?
I mean, if I had the answer to that, right, Gene?
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's been, we've been struggling, as I said earlier, and we've kind of alluded to, I mean, this is at least a decade and deeper, conversation and challenge, and Adam can, take us back way into history and talk about the rhetoric and the debate that surrounded intellectual property going back to our founding. But, I mean, if we're just zeroing in on, today, this afternoon, how do we do it? Look, I think part of the challenge is, IP and patent policy has been attached to and presented to a lot of policymakers as a solution to big problems. And, policymakers see themselves generally as problem solvers, right? I mean, they see something bad and they want to fix it. It's, part of the reason that they've, come here and they spend so much time invested in the process. So, when someone comes and says, hey, this issue of drug pricing, or this issue of access to technology, or this problem of litigation that we're seeing out there, the problem is there's these patents, right? And they're bad, or they shouldn't have existed in the first place. And here's a handful of things that you could do to fix these big problems by zeroing in on patents and how they kind of vector into this challenge, right? And I think there's some allure in that, and I think we need to do, all of us, we need to do a better job of going in and talking about and stressing the importance of strengthening patents to get us to a better place. I mean, Tim talked about the causal relationship between intellectual property and so many of the cures and the breakthroughs that we're seeing. I think, and Adam referenced some of the scholarship that Professor Barnett has done, and he's talked about the causal relationship between, big tech companies in particular and the need for weaker patents, and how, a weak patent system really empowers big incumbent companies to stay big and incumbent, right? And from a small company perspective, a startup perspective, so many policymakers strive, I think, to empower small businesses and talk about the need to create more small companies in the United States, particularly innovative, diverse small companies. So we need to have, that's the conversation that you just so desperately want to have with policymakers, right? If you are in the business of creating more innovative companies in your district, spinning them out of your university, creating them out of investments that are made in your area, creating more diversity. How do we tell diverse and thoughtful and brilliant young entrepreneurs and inventors and engineers and scientists that they should go out and start a company and do something great, when at the back end of that, they're going to be facing 16 IPRs the first time they try to commercialize what they've spent the last decade trying to invent, right? I mean, the cycle doesn't work, and it's not working for so many inventors and startups and small companies. And so, getting that to be the place where you have the conversation, in our experience, typically works. I mean, that's when you do get policymakers saying, okay, yeah, the venture capital's not going to come. The universities aren't going to, spin this technology out. The young entrepreneurs aren't going to start these companies if they don't have a strong patent system to back them up. If we can get to that place.
See, can I ask you a follow-up question specifically? And I don't know whether you know the answer to this exactly, but I had thought that when you had these high-profile, I don't know, they weren't really announcements, but people from these groups were going to conferences and they were just matter-of-factly saying, yeah, we're not doing that kind of research anymore. It was like the Cleveland Clinic was saying, we're not doing medical diagnostic research. I mean, the Cleveland Clinic, for crying out loud, and then when that's being said, and then I thought, well, now it was becoming a national security issue because manufacturing is overseas, and I thought with COVID, maybe people will wake up because the supply chain is getting disrupted, and maybe with COVID, more people will be waking up to this because, we really need to be prepared for what's next. I mean, because the patents and technology that went into this is really 10, 15 years old. There was just, the seed had been planted. We're not planting the seeds anymore for the next one.
Yeah.
Are you seeing that resonate at all?
Yeah, no, I mean, we're seeing it resonate, and we see it just from our perspective of a coalition of startups and inventors and investors, right? I mean, we see it not just resonating, but play out in real time. I'll make a couple points and then turn it over. We've done quite a bit of research in this area, and Andrew brought up a point about investment flowing to necessary areas, and where you have seen in the United States over the last 15 years or so an increase in venture capital investment. What you see when you look behind that big headline numbers, and a lot of people will say, and some of the supporters of weakening the patent system will say, well, we've got this, we've gotten patents out of the way, now there's more venture capital just net flowing in the United States, right? I mean, no causal relationship, but the reality is, yeah, there's an increased net flow of venture capital, but if you look at where it's going, it's not going to patent-intensive industries. Over the last 10 to 15 years, it went from going to about 50% of the venture capital in the United States was flowing to patent-intensive industries. Think drug discovery, core wireless technologies, semiconductors, advanced manufacturing, materials, things like that. Now it's less than 30%. And if you look at what the big, the press tells you the unicorns are, it's fintech, it's e-commerce. It's social media. It's not big breakthrough, paradigm changing technologies, right? So I mean that to me, and we've seen it, and anecdotally, yeah, we've done case studies and talked to, venture investors, incubators, startups, and they'll tell you, yeah, there's science we'd like to do, there's cures we'd like to pursue, there's devices we'd like to try to figure out how to bring to market, med tech, but we're having a hard time raising the capital to do it, and it's not something we that's going to be feasible with a 10-year time horizon. So Yeah, we're the opportunity cost is profound. It's hard to measure, but anecdotally and from a data perspective, in terms of some venture flows, it's there.
Yeah. So, Adam, I want to turn to you, and we've got a interesting conversation going, maybe, or starting in the chat about patent thickets, and that's where I wanted to go with you, because there's this belief, and there's almost a religious belief that patent thickets are bad, and that patents hold up innovation, and that patent thickets are bad. This one fellow said that patents are just, they hold up innovation. I said, well, give me one example. You can't give any examples of that. I mean, you can't even give an example. The smartphones, what exactly was held up with a smartphone patent? Nothing. I mean, every year there's more innovation in the smartphone. And the example is the Wright brothers. Well, the Wright brothers invented air flight, human flight, that was viewed impossible before that happened. And, they didn't stop Curtis from doing what Curtis was doing. So that's not an example that works either. And then Edison patents on motion pictures. That's also not an example that works either, because Edison was trying to license everybody. And there's just simply no examples of patents stopping innovation ever, period. And when you do have a thicket where you have, like in the sewing machine area where you've written about, that to me is good news, right? Because if all the players realize that we can't get away with infringing other players' patents, now we have to come together and agree on a platform and then cross-license everybody. And that's exactly what SEPs are all about, right? I mean, you're trying to create that platform so everybody can raise up the technology level. I mean, I don't see the problem here, and it really frustrates me. I mean, you're the expert on thickets. What say you when you hear these kind of claims?
Yeah, it's really great, and your examples are exactly right. So first of all, there's a confusing usage of patent thickets here, because patent thickets have meant something in the high-tech space and in the patent policy debates in the high-tech space for the past 20 years since the term was first coined. That is now the same term is being used, but it means something different in the biopharma space. So in the high-tech space, it means lots of patent owners, lots of different owners of different patents on different components of a final product that's owned by a consumer. So examples of your smartphone that you just referenced, like there's lots of patent owners that contribute to the smartphone. There's Qualcomm and Apple and InterDigital and the app developers and all the other product developers and services. And oh my gosh, that's a thicket. There's lots of patents, and how are they going to license? And yet, as you so rightly pointed out, we have a smartphone, and not only do we have smartphones, the quality. If you hold for quality control, it drops. If you hold for the prices have actually dropped with smartphones, even though it's one of the most patent-intensive industries in the entire world. And so I actually got interested in this because people were 20 years ago saying, "Oh, patent thickets, they prevent people from commercializing technologies." And so I started to look at the history and things like, as you mentioned, the Wright brothers and the sewing machine. And what you find is, yes, so in an area of technology or an area of commercial development, there are lots of people innovating and lots of different people getting patents on different components. And then because they're property rights, they're non-monopolies, they all have the economic incentive to get together and to license with each other. And they've come up with incredible tools to do this, innovative tools themselves, like patent pools, which is a commercial mechanism to get together to cross-license with each other efficiently and easily, or standard development organizations, which grew out of the private incentives to realize if everyone gets together to agree on a standard under various contractual terms, then everyone will be better off and technology will be facilitated faster. And that's exactly what's happened. In fact, contrary to the claims that patents hold up innovation and that there are patent thickets, all of our greatest innovative developments of the past 30 or 40 years have occurred at exactly the time that everyone said that we had too strong patents, that we had, patent owners abusing the system, we had all this stuff. And yet at this time, we had smartphones, we had incredible innovations in biotech and treatments of hepatitis, cures for hepatitis and diabetes and cancer, and developing the mRNA platform that led to the COVID-19 vaccine and things of this sort. And so it's just not true that there is actual any empirical evidence. And in fact, every time other people keep going back and looking at kind of the just so stories that one keeps hearing about, like the Wright brothers, for instance. So, and others have looked at this. They found it actually that licensing occurred, prices dropped, and technology grew. Just like airplanes, everyone started flying in airplanes within 20 or 30 years after the Wright brothers first flew for the very first time. Now, in the biopharma space, patent thickets mean a single owner gets a lot of patents on a particular drug, and this creates the inability for a generic to compete with them. And again, this is an area where there's just a lot of rhetoric and not a lot of facts. And unfortunately, there's just, yeah, I know, because you can only get one patent on a new invention. And if you get another patent, it has to be a new invention. It has to be a new process or a new product. And so you hear these claims like, like for instance, this organization IMAC, which has this data that everyone repeats, from congresspersons to others, right, about how many patents there are on a particular drug. So Lyrica, which is this drug that treats nerve damage caused by diabetes and hepatitis and other types of conditions, they claim that there's 68 patents on Lyrica. First of all, there aren't 68 patents on Lyrica. There's only one patent on the actual molecule. But if you actually go to the FDA's Orange Book, which is the regulatory book of approved medicines and treatment methods using Lyrica, one finds there's 4 patents that cover, 1 on Lyrica and 3 on various methods of deploying it. So which is it? Is it 68 patents or 4 patents? And they claimed Lyrica had exclusivity against generics until 2038, but there was generic entry against Lyrica in 2019. I mean, that's an established fact. And yet you see, but this information from organizations like IMAC and professors just becomes conventional wisdom, because it just keeps getting repeated again and again and again, and no one realizes that it's just not true and it's not based in the actual facts of the industry.
Yeah, and let me make a point here, because you all are too polite to probably get too awful worked up about this, although you're doing a pretty good job there, Adam. I just find the arguments from the other side of this argument so disingenuous, because they get so worked up and they say, oh, well, they're not going to be able, the generics are going to be prohibited from getting into the marketplace. That is actually simply a lie, because the patent on the underlying original drug is going to fall into the public domain, and the generic will be able to enter the marketplace with that the same as they could ever. What they won't be able to do is enter the marketplace with the latest patented treatment. So what they want to do is they want to be able to enter the marketplace and compete with the latest innovation that has been patented, not with the drug that has fallen into the public domain. So you're not being told the real truth here. Generics are not being prevented from entering the marketplace. And anybody that tells you otherwise is simply not telling you the truth. They don't understand the facts, or they're simply lying. I mean, those are the only choices here. And they're just not being honest with these types of arguments. And it's very frustrating, because it's a moving target. And when you have these kind of arguments, and then you get call them out like you point out, well, there's not 68 patents, there's only 4. Then the argument shifts. Then it's like, oh, well, then you have to deal with this. Then you have to do, there's never a realization that, oh, well, yeah, I overstepped, or I misspoke, or I was wrong, or I was, grandstanding. And it's extremely frustrating, because for the patent owners, like, to go back to what Chris was saying with the IPRs, all across the board, it feels like the patent owners have to win every single battle, and the other side doesn't seem to fight or argue nicely. Chris?
Or they have to be right once, right? They just have to win one IPR, and you could you're going to take an entire company out, right? I mean, that's the other fallacy that we see all the time. This notion that PTAB's there, these IPRs are there to take out bad patents. IPRs are being deployed against the best patents. I mean, those are the patents of the small companies and the startups that are being serially attacked by their larger competitors. They're not coming after, random patents that no one's heard of, that are completely obscure and not applicable to, major economic, relevant companies. These are patents from competitors that are doing really innovative, creative things that have a major market, impact and a potential to undercut, the size and power of a bigger competitor. Those are the patents that are being attacked at PTAB, not, bad patents, right? So, and the other, this other fallacy that, patents are bad for startups. And, maybe if you're an app developer and you're trying to create the, 47th location app to find the nearest Starbucks, yeah, someone's probably got some patents on what you're trying to do. So, maybe it's going to make it more difficult for you to do that and deploy your app or some, software gizmo that you're creating. But, if you're a biotech startup, your patent portfolio is everything you have. I mean, that is your pathway to capital. That is your pathway to commercializing these inventions, right? I mean, it's absolutely existential for you as a company. So, you see that and you hear that repeated, you go to the Hill and, well, we'd have more startups or we'd have more innovations and patents weren't in the way. And it's just like, well, maybe if you're a particular type of company to which patents are irrelevant, right? And, PTAB's taking out all these bad patents. It's blatantly false, right?
Well, and not only that, I was just reading an article the other day, and one of the, and this is not based just on the bumper slipper slogans like patent thickets or product hopping that gets so misused, but it's the bait and switch kind of approach that the critics use. And what it is it came to mind when you were just talking, Chris, about what you were saying is, it's not the bad patents that are being IPR'd. It's the good, it's the valuable patents. It's the commercially relevant patents. It's the meaningful patents. So I was reading this article, and this guy was using all these stupid, crazy patents that would make me scratch your head and say, the patent office gave a patent on that? And then actually concluded, not just kind of led you to the conclusion yourself, but concluded that because of these crazy patents that there could possibly never be a market for, that's why we have to have IPR, so we can take these patents out. Okay, well, that's idiotic. That's not what's going on. And two, he said that IPR is a cheaper, faster way to do this, which is just provably false, because IPR is not cheaper or faster. What it does is it adds an additional layer to the fight, because you fight the IPR at the patent office, then you fight it at the federal circuit in an appeal before you go to the district court, or at the same time while you're at the ITC. It's just an extra layer of cost that the patent owner has to fight in order to try and seek redress. And sometimes they got to fight dozens of these things. So it's not cheaper and faster. It's more expensive and slower. It was intended to be cheaper and faster, but we know for fact that that's not what happens. But these are the types of things that are being thrown out there and just accepted as true, despite the reality that we have facts to the contrary. Now, I'm getting worked up, and I don't want to monopolize time, and I do want to bring Andrew back into the conversation, because one of the things, Andrew, that does really bother me a lot with this conversation about patents really get in the way of innovation and aren't really useful is, if you look at the WHO, the World Health Organization, they have like a list of the essential medicines that are out there, and it's over 400 now. And I don't know where it is now. Last time I looked, it was like around 405 essential medicines. 96 or 97% of those essential medicines were patented originally. So there's a few, yeah, okay. So you have, if you want to believe that patents are not 100% necessary in order to make essential medicines, you have a few examples. But the overwhelming majority, 390 plus of the world's most essential 400 medicines, were patented. I mean, when you're dealing with these medical, because I know in the colon cancer area, you're dealing with a lot of these folks that are concerned about medical innovation. When you encounter somebody that has this, patents aren't necessary, what do you try and tell them? Or maybe even better, because sometimes they're really the believers. When you encounter somebody who wants to be informed, how do you try and get them to understand?
So you bring up a great point. When you look at the WHO's list of essential medicines, not only are 97% patented, I think the public would be interested to learn the percentage that are available as generics and as biosimilars, because I believe that percentage is over 95% as well. Mm-hmm. So the question of whether or not patents impair your ability to gain access to these medicines. You simply have to know that 95% of those medicines are already available as a generic or as a biosimilar. So that those patents certainly did not and do not prevent access to the essential medicines, do they, if 95% are already off patent? So that's number one. Number two, all you have to do is look at the biologic space if you want the best example of how innovation spurs new discoveries, which spurs effective treatment. So biologics, the next generation of drugs, beyond the pills that people see at pharmacies, we're talking about infusions for cancer, infusions for rheumatology, infusions for dermatology, for Crohn's, for colitis, for gastroenterology. All of these specialties now use biologics as their primary treatments. More than 1 billion people around the world have taken a biologic drug at this point, and that doesn't even include the vaccines.
Yeah.
So what happened when all these biologic drugs were developed and there was no pathway for, the biosimilars, what some people would refer to as generic biologics, which isn't accurate, but the biosimilars market space in the United States, all we heard when the pathway was developed more than a decade ago was that the patents protections are all going to prevent new development of biologic drugs, and they're going to prevent the development of biosimilar drugs, which are cheaper alternatives. And what we have seen is the opposite, that the U.S. is now almost leading the world in biosimilars, second only to the EU, which has had them for almost a decade longer than we had them. So right there shows you that these highly effective and highly used treatments, which have strong patent rights in the United States, and as Tim says, that's why we lead the development in the world of new and innovative medicines. And the only thing I would add to Tim's point is that not only do all of us panelists see the administration's challenge of the IP rights to the COVID vaccine as a big problem, but our allies see that as a problem too, Tim. Germany and the EU and UK and a lot of our allies reached right out to President Biden to say, no, that's a bad idea. You don't want to break your patents. You're going to, and the last thing I'll say is that when you look at the microRNA technology that went into developing the COVID vaccine, that technology was being developed for cancer. And the scientists working over in Germany that were working on the cancer vaccine, this microRNA vaccine for cancer, looked at the coronavirus and they said, you know what, this might work for that. And they kind of, so if we're going to break the patents for this, well, what are those scientists going to do? They're going to say, well, forget the development of the cancer. They're breaking our patents for this. Right. They're going to break our patents for that. And the innovation stops. So those are my final points.
Yeah. And that leads us to, and we're just about at the top of the hour. We have a number of questions. I'd like to get to some of them if we can. So we'll probably go a few minutes long here. And one of the questions that we do have asks us about that TRIPS. It doesn't ask it specifically, but it asks for us to comment on whether there is ever a public policy reason to relax or break patent holder rights for the greater good. And, I'll go first with my thoughts, and then I'll, go around the horn. I would personally have an open mind. That there is that clause in TRIPS that allows it to be done, and it's there for a reason. But for me to have an open mind about having that discussion and wanting to do it, it's got to actually matter. The problem here with doing it for COVID is it will be completely irrelevant. By the end of this year, we're going to have, just in America, just through American manufacturing, 12 billion doses of the vaccine. And that's more than one per person for the entire planet. So there is no need to have to have IP broken for this pandemic. So it's unnecessary to do. The other thing is if you listen, and we did an entire webinar on this a few months ago, if you listen to the people who are knowledgeable about this, the limiting factor really is stuff that you wouldn't think about. It's pharmaceutical grade glass, for example, for the vials. And if you take the raw resources that are necessary for the manufacturing facilities that are FDA approved and really know what they're doing, and then you just transfer them to facilities that need to ramp up, that are not approved, that really don't know what they're doing, that don't have the training or expertise to run, then you're going to really compromise the world's vaccine supply, and you're going to be making vaccine supply that is not regulated and will be unsafe for everybody. So this is a real disaster from a health perspective, not just an IP perspective, and it won't have any consequence, because by the time the ink is dried on whatever waiver gets negotiated, there's going to be more doses of vaccine just from the U.S. than are necessary. So does anybody have anything to add to that?
Well, I mean, just a couple points, Gene. I mean, to the answer to I guess the immediate answer to the threshold question of is yes, and TRIPS already kind of as you point out anticipates and has a solution set that's been agreed to and it's been around for many years. It basically says if you have an emergency, I haven't read these provisions for a while, but basically if you have a medical emergency, if you have a national emergency, and you have a party who is basically refusing to come to terms and negotiate in good faith, you can issue compulsory licenses. You can kind of work your way down that pathway, right? Which establishes a framework that is workable. And I think the other piece of this that needs to be understood is, as you said, when you get to the point of trying to facilitate this type of generic production in other countries, it's a very complicated manufacturing endeavor. It's a very difficult thing to do. And there's a transfer of knowledge that needs to take place as well. The patent and having that legal vehicle is what allows that negotiation and that transfer and that facilitation to happen between two very sophisticated parties. You have a sophisticated patent owner, and you need to have a sophisticated manufacturing partner in any country that you pick, right? And so if you don't have that legal device in the middle, that patent, you just don't enable that type of licensing arrangement to take place between those two sophisticated parties. What are you left with? I don't know what the alternative to that. I guess we're going to find out if this waiver takes place. Because you're kind of creating a new framework here that no one's really tested or tried before, and I don't think anyone knows whether or not it's actually going to work.
Yeah, it's a big issue, and there's a lot more going to be talked about it, because if this happens, it's going to happen by December or early December at the WHO next meeting. So stay tuned. We're going to stay on top of this, because it really is it's an important issue, and the one thing I would say for now, and then we can move on to the next question, I think, is this is not a situation when we're talking about, Martin Shkreli, I think his name was, where he bought the pharmaceutical company and then all of a sudden raised the price of insulin up to like $650 a dose or whatever he did. We're not talking about bad actors here. We're talking about people who actually cooperated. And if you recall, at the beginning of COVID, there was questions about whether or not the industry was cooperating too closely, and there was going to be antitrust scrutiny. And the Trump Department of Justice said, no. We're in a pandemic here. We want the industry to cooperate. We want everybody to cooperate. There will be a time when we will say, okay, we're going to start looking at these things, but until the pandemic is over, there's not going to be any antitrust scrutiny here. We want everybody to cooperate. We want all hands on deck. So the industry actually did what we wanted them to do. There's not an emergency dealing with a nefarious actor here. This was all hands on deck. So I just don't see it as necessary, or even if it was necessary, by the time it would be done, it wouldn't matter. So let's see. I answered one of the, what about patents with broad claims that fence off potential competitors? Is there anything we can do about that? I mean, my initial take on that is, that's the whole goal of a patent, is to fence off potential competitors. And you want patents to be strong. You don't want them to be weak, because if they're strong, then they force competitors to work around, and it requires innovation to move forward. I think what we've seen, for example, like in the software industry, where I know probably the best, with open source, if everything can be copied, then what you get is a bunch of copies, a bunch of copycats. You don't get a lot of innovation. Where property rights are strong, then people have to engineer around, and that's where you have real creative leaps forward. So I'm not particularly worried about strong rights or broad claims as long as they're novel. If they're not novel or they're obvious, obviously those are problematic. Any thoughts on any of that, guys?
I think just
oh, go ahead,
just
Tim.
what scares me.
Or Andrew, go ahead.
Yeah, just real quickly, what scares me in putting sort of the cherry on the top of what you said earlier is that the last thing as the patient advocate on the panel that I want to see is a bad vaccine hit the market anywhere in the world, because with my other organization, the World Patients Alliance, we spend so much energy on debunking the myths about vaccines that we don't have we have billions of people that have been vaccinated. We don't hear a lot of bad reports from it. The last thing we want in the patient world is a bad batch to get out there. And then everybody on the earth says, see that? We knew that this vaccine, blah, 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 blah. And you know how bad news spreads. So,
oh, yeah.
For us, do I, as a patient advocate, want to see the vaccine get into every person's arm on the earth as fast as possible? And even if that means breaking, some big multi-billion-dollar tech company's patent, I want to do it. Yeah, maybe on the emotional side, but in the brain side, where you actually look at data, and that's one thing that is always lacking from the other counter argument from the other side, is there's never data presented against all the discussion points that have been made today. Without that data, I as the patient advocate, I would rather see the vaccine administered a little slower but safer than putting a pin in this gigantic bubble of trust that we have for this vaccine.
Yeah.
So that was my final point.
Yeah.
One quick addition
Sure.
is that if these are a property right, patent is a property right. If the concern is fencing off potential other uses and beneficial uses and improvements, if I own a property right, but I'm unwilling to negotiate a mutually acceptable and mutually bargained price to exchange it, to license it, then it does me no good either. If I just sit on it, I'm never going to get paid for it unless I negotiate what somebody's willing to pay. And that's how a free market works. And that's how innovation occurs for everyone. And so obviously that's a deep philosophical discussion. I'm sure Adam talks about this in several lectures each semester. But, that fundamental concept of, if the fear is these patents and these property rights are going to completely eradicate that sort of innovation, that's not true, because if it is my property right, it only does me good if I'm willing to negotiate it at some point. So that was the only thing I'd add.
And that's a great point, because I've said to some extent, it doesn't matter whether you give people absolute power over their rights, because if they're unwilling to share them on some level, they're going to get exactly what they deserve, which is nothing. Because you can only make money from a property right, like a patent or copyright or whatever, if you're willing to share it so other people can benefit from it. Because nobody's going to pay for something that they can't have access to.
And patents are publicly disclosed documents, which promotes people to what we call design around, right? To create competing products. And in fact, there are many competing products, including in the biopharmaceutical industry. And in the healthcare industry, the point you keep going back to is that people create kind of stories or rhetoric around a broadly theoretical, non-data-based understanding of patents, and then they say, see, therefore patents are the problem, or IP generally is the problem. Like Martin Shkreli, there weren't any patents in that context. It was purely an FDA regulatory blockade, which is what permitted him to do that. It was the FDA, not the patent system, which permitted a competitor to step in. And yet patents were somehow all of a sudden, it was as you said, Gene, it was in all the newspapers, and it was the headlines. Oh, he's doing this because of the patent system. The patent system had nothing to do with it. And it's the same with the COVID-19 vaccine. Patents facilitated the vaccine. They made possible the investments that made possible the discovery of the mRNA platform. And there's zero evidence that patents have held up anything. And yet we are going to now waive all IP protections, not just patent protections, but all IP protections, including trade secrets, which is on the technical know-how of the manufacturing processes, which is really why they're asking for the IP waiver, because it's why they're not going through TRIPS. They went through TRIPS for the AIDS pandemic because those were patented drugs that they were trying to get compulsory licensing on. And so they were able to go through the Article 31 process. But the reason why they have been pushing for a complete waiver from TRIPS is because they don't just want to get rid of the patents. They also want to compel and coerce the transfer of trade secrets, of tech know-how. And people forget China and Russia are member states of the WTO. And so what we're talking about is coarse transfer of technical know-how. Billions of dollars of valuable knowledge of how to manufacture and make mRNA vaccines will be then given on a silver platter to China and to Russia and to other countries, whom I'm sure we can trust.
Well, and that's the funny. Before we go any further, let me push this notice because we're past the hour here. So as you are exiting, we have a link at the bottom with asking for your feedback. Really would appreciate it if you have a moment. It would just take about 60 seconds to give us your feedback. We get some of our best ideas about future programming from you guys, our audience. So if you have a moment, please do give us your feedback. We really appreciate hearing from you. So, but, you know, and it is another frustration that I have here too is I also think it is foolish for anybody to think that trade secrets are going to wind up being conveyed anyway, yeah. Right? You know, I mean, yeah, even if the IP waiver winds up being enacted, companies are gonna. What this is going to be like the thread that just you pull and then your whole sleeve of your coat winds up on the floor, right? Because sure, some trade secrets are going to be given up, you know, and there's going to be a lot of litigation, and China's and Russia and other countries are going to want all the trade secret crown jewels. But any company that would give up the trade secret crown jewels in order to appease those countries, I think the board of directors and CEO should really just be sued for malfeasance. You know, I mean, you can't do that. I mean, so this is just going to create all kinds of havoc. And it's not a good idea by any stretch of the imagination. It's going to lead to a lot of litigation. And I just don't see it happening. And even if it does get enacted, I think the temptation is going to be for some companies to just abandon countries until better wisdom prevails. Or they're gonna give up some, making it look like they've given up all, and they're gonna held back other things, and then there's gonna be all kinds of subterfuge. Oh no, we've given you all of it, and some of it's gonna be purposefully misleading. It's gonna be something like out of a Tom Clancy novel, I think. You know, and it's.
I love your optimism, Gene, but you know, I'm old enough to remember 30 years ago when something like Obamacare was thought insane and that they would never do that, or 30 years ago if they said it would be impossible for patent owners to get injunctions. It would be impossible, you know, the PTAB would be created where there'd be serial petitions. 30 years ago, people would have said, that's insane. That's never going to happen in the patent system. And yet we see it. So today's kind of crazy, insane policy proposal becomes political reality and legal reality, you know, after a short period of time because of all the bumper sticker slogans and manufacturer concerns. So this is, I think, why we should be concerned about this.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm concerned about it, but I think it's going to, we have to be vigilant, I think is what I want to say. But, you know, gentlemen, we've kept our audience for 75 minutes. I really appreciate your time. I'm going to give you in very rapid fire order an opportunity to give us your final thoughts here. So I'll go in the order in which I introduced you. Chris.
Yeah, we've covered so much, Gene. I don't know that I've got anything, you know, brilliant to wrap things up with. I mean, as I said, I do think, you know, it's always a challenge, and we need to keep up this fight because we are, you know, trying to address things that are very easy to say in a soundbite, and it consistently seems like we have the onus of a 5-minute explanation to a 5-second bumper sticker, and everything we can do collectively as a group to do what you do so well, kind of organize these thoughts, try to, you know, build consensus around responses that make sense, and keep as much attention focused on the critical value of patents and what they actually mean to the next great generation of American inventors and companies and innovators and entrepreneurs. That's where we really, really need to focus, and so often that perspective is just absolutely lost. So,
yeah. Well, great. Thank you for being here. I really appreciate your thoughts, Chris, and we'll keep on fighting. Andrew, your final thoughts here today.
So, you know, I've said it before, and I'm going to repeat it every time I'm asked, that as a society, we have to decide what's important to us. Do we want to spur investment in more medicines, or do we want, you know, more buildings, more shopping centers, more parking lots, more places that can generate revenue for investors, but that we may not value as important as a society. And I've personally seen over the last 20 years the impact of innovation on every one of those disease areas that I've mentioned, in the cancer and rheumatology and dermatology and all, and I say to all my friends, if we could just make it another 10 or 15 years, we're going to make it another 50 years. I really believe that, because the medical innovations that we're seeing now are things, that couldn't have been dreamt of 20, 30 years ago, and they're happening. And it's only going to happen by looking at the data. And the data shows that protecting these patent rights spurs innovation. And there's no counter argument that can use data to say that that's not true. And you have all done a great job, I think, in talking about history and talking about the data. And I think it's just a matter of messaging and getting that message to the right people making these decisions, that if we want, as a society, more medical breakthroughs, breaking patents is not the way to get it. It's the opposite way to get it. So that's my take on it.
Great. Thank you very much, Andrew. Adam, your final thoughts here today.
I mean, Chris and Andrew said it so perfectly well. I'll just incorporate by reference their fantastic closing statements and give more time to Timothy and you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Adam. I appreciate that. And Tim, the final word goes to you. I thought this was a fascinating conversation. Thank you for co-hosting this with me at the Center for Individual Freedom. I think this is a fantastic program, and I really appreciate your support.
Yeah, thank you all, first of all. Secondly, I'll just wrap up with a story. I attended a debate actually over whether intellectual property and patents are a natural right or simply utilitarian in origin. We all know that it's a natural right, but at any rate, a law professor, and I won't name him to embarrass him, but he teaches at a top 5 law school in the United States, and he sort of said he takes the utilitarian approach, that there's no such thing as a natural right to a patent or intellectual property. And I said, okay, let me ask you a question. Conceding for a moment that it's not a natural right, that it's all about utility, can you look across the world and name a single country, not that surpasses us, but is even remotely competitive with us in terms of innovation, whether it's artistic, scientific, in terms of labels and trademarks, not just now, but throughout human history? Can you name anybody that's even close? And he sort of thought and leaned back and said, that's an interesting question. I thought, isn't that the first question you answer when you start advocating these policies, that you have a better alternative? And so telling that story is a way of saying it's one thing to criticize our system. There's no such thing as a perfect system on Earth, but what you've got to do is come up with an alternative. Where is a better alternative out there? There isn't one. By far and away, the United States, with its strong history of protection for patent rights and intellectual property rights, leads the world in pharmaceutical innovation. We're saving lives, and there is no better alternative. So I'll leave it at that. And thank you all very, very much. I really appreciate all of this.
Great. Thank you very much, Tim. And thank you, panel. And I think that's a great place to end this, because I've always said that the other side bears a heavy burden when they're trying to say that the U.S. system is not the right system, because the U.S. system has led to tremendous innovation. We had one of the questions we didn't get to asked us to comment on Bayh-Dole. But since Bayh-Dole was enacted in 1980, we see universities have brought many hundreds of innovations to market in the biopharma area, where prior to Bayh-Dole there were zero. I mean, zero versus hundreds is a pretty stark reality, and those relate to cures and treatments and vaccines. And thousands, maybe over 10,000 startups have been started based on university technology since Bayh-Dole. And if that's the wrong system, the opponents have a very heavy burden to prove what they think is the right system. And that's what's missing in their argument. They want to break apart what has worked, but don't want to explain anything that could possibly fill the role and be better. So I think we in the pro-patent, pro-innovation society have played defense for too long. We need to play offense and make the other people show me. We need to act like we're from Missouri. Show me. Give me your information. Give me your proof. And let's talk about it in ways that you bear the burden. because we have all the information and we're willing to engage. So let's have you guys engage for once with more than just a bumper sticker. And that's my final thought today. And thank you for joining us here today. And we look forward to having you join us again. And until then, bye for now, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Gene.